cornerstone of our financial sector is, of course, the Bank of England. Known as the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, it is our central bank, issuing currency, regulating monetary policy and setting interest rates. Also holds our gold reserves and those of 30 other countries, and I'm told that the keys to those vaults are some 3 feet long. There's no chance of somebody putting one of those in their pockets. But the highlight of the city has to be St Paul's Cathedral, the masterpiece of Sir Christopher Wren. It sits on Ludgate Hill, at the highest point in the city, on the site of an old Anglo-Saxon church which was dedicated to St Paul the Apostle in 604. But that original church and several others were destroyed through the passage of time, usually by fire because they were often made of wood. Old St Paul's, that was a Norman church, was in a state of decay, and they were actually planning to build a replacement when the great fire swept through and helped to make the decision to build in stone and a new style. That's how the old church looked. So Christopher Wren had already been involved in the proposed development of Old St Paul's, so it was no surprise when he was commissioned to build the new church, and also 50 other churches within the damaged area. Now, before the fire, Wren had actually planned to replace the dilapidated tower that you can see here with a huge dome, but using that existing structure as a scaffold. But in the event after the fire, the old structure was too damaged to support the huge weight of the dome, so it had to be completely demolished. Wren's dome is the second largest in the world. It's only surpassed by Michelangelo's work at the Vatican. Internally, it's equally spectacular, and this is where many significant events are held. The Queen will mark her jubilees here, the funerals of Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, to name just 2. Lord Nelson and the Duke of Wellington are both interred here. And in a break with royal tradition, Charles and Diana were married here, the first royal wedding in the cathedral for almost 500 years. They were married here because it's much larger than Westminster Abbey. It could hold 3,500 guests compared to 2,000 at the Abbey. As Charles is heir to the throne, it was necessary to invite heads of state from around the world. So I mentioned Westminster Abbey there, so I'm now going to move into the area known as Westminster. And this is London's oldest and most important church. It was King Edward the Confessor who began building an abbey to provide himself with a royal burial church. That was about in 1050. It may be that his successor, Harold II, was the first king to be crowned in here, but we don't know that for sure. We do know that William the Conqueror was crowned in here a few months later on Christmas Day, 1066. Our current queen can actually trace her family back to him through 26 different generations, although actually it's through her maternal line rather than the royal line. And we've held every coronation since then in this church. And this is our usual venue for royal weddings and royal funerals too, and many of the monarchs are buried in here. The original church was replaced by this one in 1245. Between 1540 and 56, the abbey actually had the status of a cathedral, which saved it from the fate which affected most abbeys during the Reformation. A few years after that, it ceased to be an abbey too. Queen Elizabeth I would make it a royal peculiar, a church that's directly responsible to the monarch. Now, while it is officially known as the Collegiate Church of St Peter at Westminster, I've never ever heard it called that. There are probably more people in this room than in the rest of London who know what it's really called. Just through the west door, you have the tomb of the unknown soldier, the resting place for an unidentified British soldier killed on a European battlefield during World War I. The idea of such a tomb was conceived in 1916 by an army chaplain who was on the Western Front. He'd seen a grave marked with a small wooden cross on which the handwritten words in pencil said, "An unknown British soldier." And after the war, he wrote to the Dean of Westminster, proposing that an unidentified British soldier from the battlefields should be buried with due ceremony in the Abbey, to be buried amongst the kings, to represent the many hundreds of thousands of Empire dead. And indeed, he is among the kings. The medieval monarchs are interred in St Edward's Chapel. The coronation chair is housed there too. The nave in Westminster Abbey is relatively narrow, but it is one of the highest in the country. The south transept is home to Poets' Corner, where many literary figures are honoured. Some of them, like Geoffrey Chaucer, are actually buried there, but others have memorial plaques. I really think you could describe Westminster Abbey as a national monument, as well as our national church. In the grounds of the Abbey is the parish church of St Margaret, built by the monks of the Abbey so that the local people had a simpler church that they could attend. This is a very popular venue for society weddings. Winston Churchill was married here, as was Lord Louis Mountbatten. It's also the parish church for the Palace of Westminster, which sits directly across the road, and in fact you can see the clock tower just behind it. And I'm sure you recognise that tower. It's the most recognisable clock in the UK. And if a filmmaker wants you to know that a scene is set in London, that's always what you will see. Now, we call it Big Ben, but that's not the correct name. Big Ben is actually the name of the largest bell inside it, the one that chimes on the hour. Well, it did until this week. It was silenced on Monday. They're doing repairs to the tower, and they feel that this loud bell is going to be harmful to the workmen. So it's been stopped for the next 4 years. It will only ring on Remembrance Sunday and New Year's Eve. The tower itself is actually called the Elizabeth Tower. It's only had that name in recent years. It was renamed in 2012 to mark the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. So if we look at this picture of the Palace of Westminster from the river, it's certainly the Elizabeth Tower that makes it recognisable. But at the other end is a large square tower, and that one's actually called the Victoria Tower, and that was named for Queen Victoria on her Diamond Jubilee. So we have that symbolic symmetry honouring our two longest serving monarchs. And then the building in between houses our Parliament. First royal palace here was built on the site in the 11th century. It was the main royal residence until fire destroyed much of the complex in the 1500s. The renovated building became the meeting place for the Parliament. It was also the Royal Courts of Justice at that time too. But in 1835, an even bigger fire ravaged the palace, and it almost had to be completely rebuilt from scratch once again. The architect was Charles Barry. I spoke about him when I talked of Dunrobin Castle in my talk on Invergordon, and I know that some of you went there yesterday. He incorporated what remained of the old building into this new Gothic palace. The oldest part is Westminster Hall. That dates back to 1097, so that's still part of the original building. Today that's used as a ceremonial room for the lying in state of a sovereign or their consort, and the Queen Mother was the last instance. Now we have a bicameral government, and both houses sit in this building. Security is very tight, as you can imagine. The building has been targeted by the IRA in the past, and more recently by IS. Now if you look across the river from the Elizabeth Tower, you can see this wheel. It's known as the London Eye. It was intended to be a temporary addition just for the year of the millennium, but it's proved to be so popular that it has become a permanent feature. You travel slowly around one circuit in a glass pod, and you're rewarded with great views over London, and on a clear day you can see out to the home counties. In front of the Palace of Westminster is Parliament Square. Now obviously because of its proximity to the Houses of Parliament, it's an obvious place for political demonstrations. There are a series of 11 statues around the square, honouring various British and foreign statesmen, Winston Churchill, Nelson Mandela, Abraham Lincoln, to name just 3. So to put this place into context, just to the right of it, you can't see it here, but that would be Westminster Abbey. You've got the Houses of Parliament here. You can just see the wheel across the river on the left-hand side. But we're going to leave now and take this road, and this is called Whitehall. It's a wide street. It's lined with government offices. We've got the Treasury, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, and so on. The second road on your left is Downing Street, which of course is where our Prime Minister lives at number 10. But for security reasons, that road is gated. Whitehall forms the centrepiece of our Remembrance Day memorials. The cenotaph here on the left was designed by Lutchens, the architect who submitted those grandiose plans for the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool. And the memorial you can see on the right, it's relatively new. It's a monument to the women of World War II. That was unveiled on the 60th anniversary of the end of that conflict. And then you'll come to Horse Guards.